Okay, so b'siyata d'shmaya, with Hashem's help, first of all, acknowledging the great chesed of the shul for allowing us to use this room, Be'ez Hashem, for Thursday nights, and maybe for other times during the week as well, but at least for Thursday nights, to be able to have our chabura in a place that's central, familiar, and a place which is, I think, a little bit, for a number of reasons, practical and also just atmospheric, I think is more conducive to what we're trying to develop as a chabura, as yidden that are trying to connect to each other, trying to connect to something central where all of us can connect to yiddishkeit in a very deep level, and connect to Shabbos, which will be continuing our Shabbos shiurim, but with a new setup, and that's what we spoke about, which I'm happy about, because I don't really like starting something and then stopping in the middle, and there's no reason really to do that. People are enjoying it, but the shiurim are a little bit too long, and if they're too long for me, they're certainly too long for others, and some have voiced that, and we're trying to make it so that mamish people can come together. Like we said, people don't have so much brain capacity left at the very end of a long week. There will be other opportunities for more in-depth shiurim, and so we'll continue with our exploration of Shabbos, but we'll try to make it more Farbrengen style, the Torah afterwards, and generally in a different kind of ruach, and henceforth the chabura shall be named Chaburas Raza de Shabbos. Chaburas Raza de Shabbos. Alel Shishi is also, it's a chabura. It's not a shiur. It's not a program. It's a chabura. It's a chabura of yidden that are really here for the same reason, because we sense that we want to go deeper. We want to go deeper. So with all of this in mind, b'siyata d'shmaya, tonight we're going to focus on Lag BaOmer, Ha'ba'alinu l'taiva. It's also Pesach Sheni. Maybe we'll get to mention that as well. And we're going to jump in. Hey, David, great to see you. Thanks for coming. We're going to jump into this teaching, and we'll see how far we get. There's no pressure to finish all of it. Every word is gold. From Rebbe Yablana Reba Shlita. Rebbe Yablana being one of the Gedolei Breslov for the last couple of decades in Eretz Yisrael, widely accessible, not just to Breslover Hasidim, but known throughout Am Yisrael as a tzaddik, as a mekubal, as a kaddish. And I feel particularly connected to Rebbe Yablana because there's a family connection. My father is very, very close with Rebbe Yablana and had been since he was a bacher, and so we have a very strong kesher. But beyond that, I did not go one Lag BaOmer as a bacher in Eretz Yisrael without going to Rebbe Yablana for Lag BaOmer. That was my place. I would go to Meiron also when I could, but the main thing was, like, even if it was like between the two, I would go to Rebbe Yablana, and his Lag BaOmer is mamish something else. So this sefer, of which these pages are photocopies of, is a small kuntris. It's not like an official hardcover sefer. It's a small softcover kuntris of his, which is a collection of his teachings that he gives over at those Lag BaOmer events year after year, and each one is a separate mimer. So we're jumping in the middle of a mimer because he speaks for a very long time, and we're going to try to get through it. It's easier reading our stories. It's a little bit lighter, and it's just sweet. It's absolutely sweet and beautiful. The pages should have been stapled the other way, but it's okay. We'll figure that out together. So with Hashem's help, let's begin. First, Rebbe Yablana talks about a very fundamental teaching from the tzaddik Rabbi Nachman, who begins his Sefer Likutei Moharan even before he actually starts the Sefer, which starts here, right? This is Torah Aleph. This is where the Sefer starts. So before the Sefer starts, there's a little paragraph on the bottom. That's called the Hashmata Torah. It's the Torah that is like, it's an appendix, but it doesn't come in the back. It comes right in the beginning. It's not part of the Sefer, but it's the foundation, literally, that the whole Sefer is built on, right? Literally. And that small teaching, I'm just going to say it outside. I don't have time to go through it inside. Rabbi Nachman says that the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that the Sanhedrin was going from place to place. They were in Galus, and they ended up in a place called Kerem B'Yavneh. Kerem B'Yavneh. Different opinions why it's called Kerem B'Yavneh, but Al Kapanim, they sat around in certain rows like a vineyard. They came to the conclusion through Ruach HaKodesh that unanimously, this is 70 Ga'onim Gedolim you can't imagine. With Ruach HaKodesh, they said unequivocally the Torah is going to be forgotten from Klal Yisrael. Asida Torah shetishtachach miYisrael. Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai stood up, the 71st, and he told them, no, The Torah will not be forgotten from Am Yisrael, and he quoted a pasuk to back himself up. The pasuk says in Devarim, "Ki loy si shakach mi pizare." It will not be forgotten from his descendants, right? From the descendants of Am Yisrael. The Torah will not be forgotten. So Rabbi Nachman reveals a very deep secret which was hidden in plain sight, and he is the first. This is an original chiddush, which is phenomenal. That in thousands of years of Jewish scholarship, we needed to wait until 280 or so years ago for Rabbi Nachman to find this remez is shocking, because it's right there. Says the Rebbe, well, look at the Seifet Tevis of those words that Rebe Shimon bar Yochai used to back his claim up that the Torah would never be forgotten, mizaroi, from which on a literal level means the generations of Am Yisrael till the end of time. He says the pasuk is ki loy si shakach mi pizare. The Sofei Tevos, the last letters of these words spell, it's a yud, it's an aleph, it's a ches, it's another yud, and a vav spell yochai. Mamish. In that pasuk is encoded the father of this Tana, Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai, and a reference to Zareh, right? A reference to Yochai's children, who would be the one thousands of years later to go ahead and to use this very pasuk as a proof text that the Torah wouldn't be forgotten. It's a pellet. It's you see the way that the Torah encodes everything before it happens in such a dramatic way. Kilai si shakach mi pizare. That's Rabbi Nachman's teaching. So here he is making reference to that teaching. He assumes that we know it, and we do. Says Rabbi Yaakov, Havana ayin ma'at b'dvar v'akdoshim sham. Let's take a look at that Gemara there. Rabbeinu mevi midivei Chazal, the Gemara in Shabbos, Kuf Lamed Ches Lamed Beis, Kishenichnu Rabbeinu leKerem B'Yavneh. When they went to this place of Yavneh, and Yavneh nimnes al achas me esra galuya shagol sebem Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was exiled to 10 different places, 10 different stops, and this was one of them. He says this is mamish like the place where the Sanhedrin sat in the Beis Hamikdash. Sham ha'isashras Ashreinu. There was the resting of the divine presence. Kol Torah kadosh ha'isagluyo prusha leineim. These tzaddikim had the whole Torah open book on their fingertips. When they said in their Ruach HaKodesh that the Torah was going to be forgotten, they saw this clearly. It wasn't an opinion; it was a fact that they saw. Ruach HaKodesh doesn't. It's not like a subjective thing. This is what they saw. They foretold a time where there would still be Jews, but the Torah would be forgotten. Looking through the sands of time, all of history, and what Am Yisrael would go through, all the pain and all the suffering and all the persecution, and all the terrible kinds of suffering, and the forced conversions and the inquisitions and the Holocaust and everything that we would go through, in all the years of their long exile. To them, it was an impossibility. From their perspective, that Am Yisrael would make it. It was just impossible. And their Ruach HaKodesh was right. It was impossible for Am Yisrael to make it. It was objectively impossible. See how he develops this. That the Torah should remain within Am Yisrael. When he saw this overflowing measure, sevel of pain, inuyim and suffering, that they would experience. Every part of Am Yisrael has suffered in some way. Isn't that interesting? There's really no part of Am Yisrael, or no significant part of Am Yisrael, that was totally spared any kind of indignity throughout the years of Gullus. And no matter whether you were in Ashkenaz, whether you were in Sfarad, there was persecution of Jews across the board. And so to them, seeing this vision, they had perfect clarity that it's just not going to happen. It's not going to work. For Rebbe Sefer Shevet Yehuda, he says, take a look in the Sefer Shevet Yehuda. He always quotes many different Svarim, even rare Svarim. Whose author lived close to the time of the Rishonim. That's one of the Svarim that you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av because it describes the travails of the Jewish people. Hamataris hagezeres v'hasevel harav shel Yisrael begalusam. Now that sefer describes what Am Yisrael are going through, what we've been through. Uman Hashem lamed vav gezeres ne'roi she'avral b'nei Yisrael, and it describes 36 terrible decrees that the Jewish people experience begashmius, beruchnius, spiritually, physically. Anybody who sees this is shaken up. They can't fathom what we've been through as a nation. We can't fathom it. Which sane person? It's almost strange that they needed Ruach HaKodesh, but they didn't. You understand? The Ruach HaKodesh wasn't about Am Yisrael forgetting the Torah. The Ruach HaKodesh was seeing what Am Yisrael would go through. The only logical conclusion that they could draw from this is that the Torah would be forgotten, because it is impossible. He says, "Who mi haya yachal la'alis al daitam sha'amnam tuchal set pezuri Yisrael la'amen neged hazeh evim shebal l'tarfa v'la'achina." How could it be that anybody would have imagined that Am Yisrael would be able? This very beautifully describes this one lone sheep would be able to escape the 70 wolves, the nations that are trying to devour. Next paragraph, and of course he's saying this in Yiddish, so they bring the Yiddish, which is, it's always gavalt, like in Svarim that are in Hebrew, but the original is in Yiddish. There are some things that they bring in Yiddish because the Hebrew can't capture it, right? And so they bring this in Yiddish. I'm not even going to try to butcher it, but we'll just appreciate the fact that it's probably better in the Yiddish for a Yiddish speaker. Anshel, want to take it away? The Yiddish?
Yiddish, no.
No, you're not. No, you're not a Yiddish speaker.
No Yiddish.
Is anybody here a Yiddish speaker? Hat sich gar nicht genart min uns. It probably sounds better with an actual Hasidic.
Was this sefer written in Yiddish originally, though?
The speeches were given in Yiddish, so it's a recording of the drushes. So he says Hashem has not made any kind of mistake with us in entrusting us with this mission. Uve'emes shemash nish'arnu b'nei Yisrael arizeh b'koach midas hakashis oirif shabanu. He says this, that we've survived, and not just that we've survived, but even we've thrived, and this, that the Torah is flourishing in a way that it never flourished, maybe even throughout our history, at least quantitatively. That's testament to our inborn kashius oirif, right? We're an ankshe oirif, or we're stubborn people. We're people that can handle things that no nation could dream of handling, of experiencing. Our Mesiras Nefesh from the moment that we were formed, coming up to Shavuos. And indeed, we all deserve, if we're here, and if our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents and the Jewish spirit that we contain within ourselves, we are ra'ui to be called the Banim Shal Makom. How glorious it is to be here in 2023, Al Saf HaGeula, on the threshold of redemption, still doing this and coming together to learn and to connect and holding on to our Amunah. We're Banim Shal Makom. Shenasharnu ne'emanim lei. We've remained faithful to Him. Va'anu zoichim lahamlich as Hashem Yisbarach cherev hatzaros hanerois sheinu shkuim behem tamal amala mitzavarenu. And we're zoiche to be mamlech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, despite all of the terrible pain that we go through. And here he's speaking about persecution, exile, but think about your own life, and I'll think about my own life, the suffering that we experience on a personal, individual level. And we're here, we're still here. V'achein, ekev ne'emanusam hanitzchis shal Yisrael am kedoshai. Taking into account this eternal faithfulness, this eternal bond that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We put out that little clip about one of the Shabbos shiur, that very first Shabbos shiur. That's what Shabbos is, right? The Shabbos candles. Every single week we come back and light the Shabbos candles. It's a testament to that eternal bond that we have with Hashem. Yibatza HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'yigmar es masha olah b'machshavte lebatza lebetza be'emtzes brias es ha'olam. So we can rest assured that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, He chose correctly. He gave us a mission, and we are faithfully carrying it out, despite the fact that those among the Jewish nation that are still, quote-unquote, at least consciously or wakefully faithful is a tiny percentage point. It makes no difference. After what we've been through, that's to be expected. And it's our job to do the best that we can to portray a yiddishkeit of health and of shining glory and balance so that we can bring people closer. and so that they can find a path that will infuse their lives with meaning. But again, that is to be expected, right? That's the Ruach HaKodesh. That's 70 member, and that's really a rabbim, right? 70 to 1. They saw that this is, this is what is obviously the trajectory. So that means that we're mamash a chiddush. It's not a chiddush that 99.9% of Yidden are not. Tinik shenishba, this, that, who has cheshbah, who knows, who knows, right? Not our place to judge. It's our place to try to be of service, right, and to help. But we have to appreciate the smallest effort that we're able to make, and not that we should settle for that. We have to, adrabah, if we're connected and we're awake, we have to shoot for the stars. But along the way, right, every step to appreciate what a miracle it is to be a Jew, what a miracle it is to be a Yid that's still saying Shemana Esrei, that was instituted by the Anshe Knesset Agdayla in circumstances radically different than the ones that were experienced by all of our grandparents who passed on the baton faithfully, even though they had every reason not to. It's a miraculous thing. We don't appreciate it. Right? We don't appreciate it. He says Hashem did not make a mistake. Kodesh Baruch Hu chose correctly. And this that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised to Avram Avinu at the bris bein absarim v'chein iskayim banu mashenis nabu hanaviyim shenizke levasoif, that at the end we'll make it. We're going to make it in the end. We're going to turn, like the Lubavitch Rebbe used to use this Yiddish, I do know, Karavelt, he used to say, right? That we have to turn over the world. We have to turn over the world, and we will. We will. La'at, we have to be patient. It's a long process. But in the end, we will merit to this description of the Navi, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has prepared, not for those that do everything perfectly, but yaseh lamachakim, to those that are still in the game, to those that are still holding on to a shred of faith, despite experiencing such challenges, both physical and spiritual, and then individual, and that keep holding on because they know that this is the emes and it's something I'm willing to fight for, even though I feel pushed down 1,000 times. Lamachakim, we hold on to this yearning, we're going to make it in the end. Ubelvad. Hey, thanks for coming. We have papers here. Ubelvad. Here. Ubelvad. Shenishar nemanim lo yizbarach la'ad l'netzach netzachim ukshurim imay bebris netzach le'tupar. We're going to hold on. We're going to hold on, and that's what we need to do. Is to hold on. Now let's take a look at that medrash that we began with, which is really a Gemara, the Gemara in Shabbos, but it's an Agadata. It's a story. That there was some kind of machloikis. So he asks a very simple question. They were all seeing the same vision. Right? Both of them had to have been right. They were seeing a spiritual representation of the future. That's not something to have an opinion about. That's just a fact. So what was their machloikis really? How was there room for a machloikis in something that we refer to as mitzias? It's just a fact. How do you have a machloikis in mitzias? This is not subject to interpretation. It's there. Is it going to be forgotten or isn't it going to be forgotten? This one's going to say yes. They're going to lose it. Well, which one is it? What is this machlekes? So what I neglected to mention is that when Rabbi Nachman quotes this Gemara, and he begins his sefer with this, he says, Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai, which is parenthetically Gematria Nachman ben Simcha, exactly, 553, and there's a very deep connection between Meron and Uman, Rabbi Nachman and Rebbe Shimon. But he begins, Rebbe Shimon ben Yochai hivitiach. Rashbi promised Shaloi Tishtakach Torah Yisrael al Yadai, that by his merit, meaning if he had anything to do with it, the Torah was not going to be forgotten. And this was a promise that he made al Yadai because of his own merit. Now that's not in the Gemara. If you look in the Gemara, it's just this one said this and that one said this. There's no haftacha and there's no al yadai. Says Rabbi Yaakov Meir Shechter, Rabbi Nachman came to Bavarn this question. Because he also struggled with this question. How are they arguing in Metzias? See, he says, V'kushiyat suma, this tremendous question and challenge, Miyasher Rabbeinu HaKadosh b'Isafas teva achas. The Rebbe resolves by adding this one word, hivtiach. What does this mean, hivtiach? So he says like this. Ve'inin bezehu, ki amnam gam Rashbi ra hakal. He says, Rebe Shimon Bar Yochai was no less of a visionary than they were. He also saw hakal, right? He also saw this. Rashbi also saw what they were going to see. V'av gam ras tsaris Yisrael shal piyam achena sida tar shetishtachach. He also saw the same thing, that there's going to be suffering and there's going to be challenges and travails throughout history. He saw it with the same clarity that they did. That it's true, the suffering would be so incredibly great that asida tar shetishtachach. But then Rebbe Shimon dipped very deeply into his own immense holiness. Who can imagine in the Zohar Kodesh, it's many passages talking about different things, stories and conversations with Malachim and Rebbe Shimon, in control of the whole thing, like his spirit was unbelievably, unfathomably great. We know from the Zohar Kodesh that Reb Shimon had constant hashras Ashreinu. Moshe Rabbeinu v'Eliyahu Hanavi u'Malachim iloi nimtzu b'mechitzas yom v'layla. All the Avis HaKadoshim, all the tzaddikim were with him all the time. V'tamid liat eish sviva. It's described that he had a fire surrounding him all the time. He was a great tzaddik. He was a great person. Kam hashras Ashreinu yesh kan. To understand what Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai is. The Kodim is Talkusa Gila Rashbi, to the point, again, he's just demonstrating the greatness of Rebbe Shimon. That before Rebbe Shimon's Histalkus from the world, Gila Harashbi Rebbe Shimon revealed, and this is enigmatic, but it's very deep and it's very beautiful, Shekol Yamav, that all of his days, Haya Etzlai Rak Bebechinas Anila Daidi. As if that's not enough. By Rebbe Shimon, all of his days, every waking moment, and I'm sure every sleeping moment if he slept, was an aspect of Ani L'Daidi. That was his madrega, his whole lifetime. Every single second. Ani l'daidi. I am to my beloved. And then he revealed B'shas Histalkus, which is the day that we're coming to, Rebbe Shimon's day, Lag BaOmer, which is the day of his Histalkus. He told his Talmidim that he gil madrega nairav and his gava kazu. He reached a level, such a lofty, elevated level of his bate, and he revealed to them sha'achshav, that now hu higia kfar l'v'daidi li. Then on the day of his Histalkus, he finally reached, whatever this means, I don't know, the Daidili. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, my beloved, is to me. Shu kesher v'shaychus nitzchis in Borei Olam. It's being subsumed, as it were, within the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shu l'mala mimenu, like Moshe Rabbeinu also is very connected to Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, because Moshe Rabbeinu gives us the Torah of Nigla, and Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai gives us the Torah Hanister. And that's one neshama that tzaddikim describe, that it's one neshama that keeps on coming back throughout history. But everybody agrees that there's a very deep connection between Moshe Rabbeinu and Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai. And Moshe Rabbeinu also, on the day of his Petira, he reaches Nun Shari Bina. He reaches a place that's called Har Nevai. The Arizal says, Har Nun Bai. Right? The 50 gates of Bina enter Moshe Rabbeinu, and he didn't know where he's buried. The Gemara says even Moshe didn't know. And Rabbi Nachman says what it means that Moshe didn't know where he was buried. Most people don't know where they're buried because they're buried, right? Unless they planned it out beforehand, which most people do, right? But he didn't. What does it mean he didn't know, says Rabbi Nachman? Because Moshe Rabbeinu reached a level on the day of his Petira where he couldn't know anything because there was no him to know. He was batal b'metzias. He didn't have an independent consciousness anymore. He was completely, I don't know the word, aligned, completely enmeshed, intertwined, interpolated with Hashem. Yeah. What do you mean?
I'm open to receiving. Flood me. That's that final stage. It's exactly the same thing.
Wow. So you're saying calls man that Rebbe Shimon is a bechina of ani l'daidi. There's a me, and then there's a giving. So the way I was thinking about it is that on the day of the Patira, the Vidoidi, that aspect of Vidoidi, it's not ani. It's not Vidoidi le'ani. It's Vidoidi li. It's like the aleph and the nun of ani disappear. Thanks for coming. And all that's left is the yud. It's like it's swallowing me up. Vidoidi li yud. It's like there is no me anymore. It's just yud, and yud is always a reference to Hashem. And I'll call upon him. There's already parshanas, but the day that Rebbe Shimon leaves the world, he reaches such a madrega. Shu kesher v'shaychus nitzchis in boiri olam she'ein lamal mimenu. He says the Chachamim saw with Ruach Chodesh shetishtachach Torah miYisrael, that the Torah would be forgotten. Again, that was the natural way of assessing the situation. If anybody would be privy to see at that time what Am Yisrael would go through, and they would witness Auschwitz, and they would witness the Inquisition, and they would see what's going on, they would come to the same conclusion. In accordance with every kind of natural estimation. Like we said, Yisrael, all the pain that we'd go through. But Rebbe Shimon dipped again into his own koyach, into his own power, into his own merit, into his own zechus, and he promised, Sha'afal pi shekulam rayim. All of us see. I like you, said Rebbe Shimon. We all see the same thing. But the difference is that they were seeing things without Rebbe Shimon. Rebbe Shimon was seeing things from the perspective of knowing just what he was capable of. By applying his koyach, both spiritually, meaning on a metaphysical level, and on a very practical level, in terms of what he taught Am Yisrael, in terms of the chizuk that he gave Am Yisrael, in terms of the way that Rebbe Shimon made it so that a Jew can go through whatever he or she goes through, in their individual lives or as part of the klal, and their understanding of their kesher to yiddishkeit goes so much deeper than whatever they may happen to see in the mirror or whatever they may happen to know about their behaviors. It's essential. Rebbe Shimon revealed all the teachings about the neshama's bond with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, chelek alekamimal, all these ideas, because it's a nishmasa di araisa. It refers to that place in the Torah where it's beyond earning or deserving. It just is. Yisrael ala b'machshava tchila. Kol Yisrael b'nei malachim heim, is Rebbe Shimon, right? So those teachings very practically kept us going. So it's not just in his zechus, in his koyach. Very practically, the hashkafas that Reb Shimon introduced into yiddishkeit by revealing the Zohar Kadosh, because at that point in history it was time for that layer of disclosure, which continued with the Arizal, which continued with the Baal Shem and the Gra Leminehem in their own Batei Medrash, which continued ultimately, at least from a Breslau perspective with Rabbi Nachman, further and further degrees of revelation of this. Because Am Yisrael, wandering further and further from Har Sinai, would need deeper and deeper infusions of light to illuminate their position in the darkness of the pit within which they were continually sinking. That's all Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon is that light. Or mufla, roimala. We're going to dance around a bonfire somewhere, or hopefully we'll get to break together. We have a few events going on, but Ezra Hashem, with the evening bass, hopefully is going to be very, very beautiful. Very beautiful. I mamish haven't touched the guitar, the whole sphere, and it's like I'm itching, so it's extra special. That reunion. Reb Shimon is Eish. Reb Shimon is a fire. And fire is really two things. Fire is clarity, it's light, and fire is warmth. And that's what Reb Shimon is, light and warmth. Light meaning clarity into what's really going on. What's really going on, who you really are, beyond what you may struggle with or mistakes that you may have made. Clarity into yourself, clarity into big picture understanding of what the world is, that the world has a soul because the Torah has a soul, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with the Torah, and the Torah has a soul, so then the world has a soul. To be able to look at things with deeper eyes. This is the koyach of Reb Shimon that's kept us alive in Galus. And so they were seeing things without the presence of Reb Shimon. But Reb Shimon bar Yochai, and this is the Lashon, hivtiach. B'koyach dushasa hivtiach, sha'afal pi shekulam rayim, even though everyone sees sha'al pi amet siyas tishtakach, Torah Yisrael, that the Torah is going to be forgotten. But hu yimna zois, he will step in to prevent this from happening. V'chihu mikabel al atzmai laha'ir haTorah b'Yisrael b'chol hadayros. That means you and me are sitting here now in the schus of Rebbe Shimon bar Yochai. To put this into different terms, Lag BaOmer is not simply it's just a study, a side thing that has developed some strange minhagim over the years, and some people, recognize it, some people don't recognize it. We don't say tachnun. Is it his yard side? Isn't it his yard side? Machlokes and whatever. This is not a side thing. This is literally the absolute foundation upon which every facet of our yiddishkeit, the araisa, the rabbanon, shalosh regalim, every mesechta and shas, literally relies on the foundation of Lag BaOmer, Pile Plais, in accordance with what we're saying. We are here today because of Rebe Shimon, because of what he accomplished, because of what he taught. Because a Torah without nishmasid v'araisa is like a guf without neshama, and it cannot last very long. The longevity of a guf, which without the neshama would wither within a matter of days, is due to the presence of the neshama. And if all we have is hein gufei halachas, so that's not gonna last without an infusion of the vitality, consciously or subconsciously, whether we're aware that it comes from Nister, hishtel davek, that no matter the simplest mitzvah that you do is already filled with so much light and so much secret. It would be almost unrecognizable if we were to remove the influence of the Zohar Kadosh from yiddishkeit. It would be unrecognizable to us. Even to those that are so-called, rationalist Jews, which is a ridiculous pair of words. What does that mean? There's nothing rational about waving plants around. It's ridiculous. Yiddishkeit, it's not rational. It's not irrational. It's super rational. Super rational, right? There's no good. There's no whatever. I'm not going to go down that whole road now. But yiddishkeit is filled with so much secrets and so much mystery, and it's the mystery that keeps us hoping. It's the mystery that keeps us alive. Because the way that we see things on the surface, I'd have given up 1,000 years ago. I'd have given up this morning. I'd have given up any time that I go on the news and I read what's going on in the world. I'd have given up. If all there was to what's going on is this. I don't mean you find wonderful people. I mean what's going on in the world. Rebe Shimon brings the neshama into things and tells us there's more. There's something worth hanging around for. There's a process that's unfolding. So Rebbe Shimon was the one that took it upon himself. I'll just do one more paragraph. Take a look at it says Tzadi Ches on the top. The foundation of the chizuk of Rabbi Nachman, but it's an extension of the chizuk of Rabbi Shimon. It's all the same thing. This that Hashem says through the prophet, through the Navi Malachi, Ahavti eschem, Amar Hashem. Hashem, in a moment of just of total disclosure, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's like Lo Yuchal Yosef Le'Sapik, because Hashem is always sending us little hints, like I tolerate you, I'm okay with you, the pasuk of Devarim, Lo Mirubchem Chashik Hashem B'chem, or don't think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose you for you, it's because of the others, but then Asachakol, this pasuk in Malachi lays it bare. Hashem says, you know something? Ahavti eschem. I absolutely adore you. And the chizuk of Reb Shimon, and the chizuk of the Baal Shem, and the chiddush of Rebbe, all the tzaddikim, zeh hoylech al kol echad v'echad miyisrael mamish. This is not talking about the collectivity of this idealistic concept of the chosen nation that Hashem loves. It literally means me. And it literally means you. And you, and you, and all of us. Ahavti eschem, each one of you individually, Amar Hashem. No matter what you are going through, like a father loves his child, no matter what he is going through. Every single Jew needs to know this. And not just in this cliche kind of way, Hashem loves you. In a very, very deep way, because we have to understand what Hashem is and what loves is and what you is. Otherwise it becomes a Hallmark card. Hashem loves you. Okay, so put a sticker on your car, which is still good, but to come to the definition of what it means, me, what it means Hashem, and what it means loves, That's something that we need to explore, something that we need to understand. What's the nature of this love? And how does that align with some of the ways that I find myself acting or stumbling over? Like how does this fit? Who am I? And who is this being, Hashem? And what's the nature of His love? Every Jew needs to know that his shirish, again in the pneumius, in the essence of who we are, is extremely and incredibly lofty. We are the reflective embodiment of Hashem's initial thought, the creative spark that Hashem began the whole Seder Shalshos creating the world with. The Lanu HaNevraim Ein HaYicholis La'agia La'Saganei Rav Neskavazu. We can never fathom the holiness of our souls. We can never fathom it. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Am Yisrael through his Navi, Ahavti eschem, I loved you, I love you. Yablana Rabbeinu, Rabbi Nachman reveals this is every Jew. He needs each and every person. And he's close and he's present with every yid, even if that Jew should be found in the lowest place. Whatever category of lowliness, maybe even all of them. I'm sure even all of them. He says there are Jews that find themselves in a very, very dark place, in a low place, in a confused place, in a frustrated place. And he says they're gonna give up, as so many Jews did. It was just the yahrzeit just now, the Yablana Reba. Anybody heard the story of the Yablana Reba? Very, very briefly. It's a bit of a long story, but just briefly, and I promise we'll make this shiur shorter, but very, very briefly, that's a new sign, something I struggle with, but very briefly, there was a yid called Rabbi Cheskel Taub. Cheskel Taub is the name of all the Mudgets, it was a dynasty. It was the name of Rabbi Cheskel of Kuzmir, who was the forebear of the Mudgets dynasty. But they're all called Yecheskel Taub. But the last name is Taub. That's the Mudget's name, and they're all called Yecheskel after Rabbi Cheskel Mikuzmir. So there was this yid who inherited the mantle of leadership in a Chasidus called Yarblan, which was one of the offshoots of Mudgets before the war. And it was a pretty sizable Chasidus. He had a couple of hundred Chasidim, and he had a shul and a whole thing. He was a very young man when he became the Rebbe. He was mamash leading hundreds of people, and he was incredibly pure and incredibly passionate and incredibly deep and sensitive. And he was mamash a real Rebbe. And after World War I, it became clear to him that Mashiach is mamash coming, is about to come. And he felt that it was very important to emigrate to Eretz Yisrael, which there was nothing there, right? It was Palestine. There was really nothing going on. And he tried to collect funds, and he eventually convinced the wealthy Hasidim there to invest in buying large properties, large segments of land there, so that when he would go with the chalutzim, the pioneers, and work the land and develop and build, then those Hasidim would be able to come and they'd have land that they invested in and let others do the work, so to speak. And this was the arrangement that they had. They bought very large plots of land. He traveled and he convinced hundreds of Hasidim, the majority of his Hasidim, to travel with him to Eretz Yisrael. These are people that left everything behind, their families behind. They left everything behind. And they came to a place, the land that they had bought, and they decided to name this place Kfar Hasidim, right? Which is a big yishuv today. But they began to develop this land, and it was just failure after failure after failure after failure. None of them had begun to imagine the hardships that they would experience, to the point that, first of all, there was a drought. A couple of years after they moved there, people were mamish. They had no water to drink. they didn't know what they were doing, how to develop land. They couldn't make any money. The funds from Europe started to close. It seems that there was malaria. There were mosquitoes that were biting people. People were dying. It was mamish like it was a failure of a failure of a failure of a failure. So bad did the situation get that the Yablana Reba felt that he had no choice but to sell the land that the Hasidim back in Europe had invested in to others, and then carry on as sharecroppers because it wasn't working. It wasn't working, and people were mamish dying. It was a case of pikuach nefesh. And can you imagine how broken he was? There are pictures. I have pictures over here because I just spoke earlier to the Chevra, the clubhouse, and I told this story. This is the Yablana Rebbe before the war. Very sensitive, you can see, very gentle Yid. He almost looks Sephardi, that's how gentle and holy he looks, but he wasn't. and this is him, the Rebbe with his Hasidim, who had just come from Poland, or I'm not sure if it was Poland or Ukraine or where, and they're standing out there with axes. These are Yidden that were in the Beis Medrash, and they're out there in the fields doing work. It wasn't simple. Here's the Yablana Rebbe sitting next to Rav Kook, who came to visit, surrounded by all the Hasidim that he convinced to move with him to Eretz Yisrael. That was the stature. He was Mamash Rebbe. Finally, push came to shove. He didn't know what to do. The Mamash had no money, and he said, "Listen, I'm gonna travel to America a couple of months, make a couple of ruble over there, collect funds, and I'll come back after a fundraising trip." He had a family in California, and this is where he went. While he went, World War II broke out. He wasn't able to travel back, so he was living there as a frum, obviously extra frum, so to speak, Yid, an Admar, in the community. But slowly but surely, as news of what was happening in Europe started to make its way over the ocean, the 1-2 punch of the failure in Palestine and the destruction of European Jewry was too much for him, and he left. He left everything. He shaved his beard in payas. He changed his name to George Nagel. He obscured all records of where he had come from, broke ties with every single person in the frum community, lived by himself in the suburbs somewhere, and began to work in a shipyard, because that was his profession. And this is how he lived for decades and decades and decades, nobody knowing anything about him. So much so, actually, parenthetically, an interesting anecdote. Once I'm telling the story, I might as well tell it right. One tiny anecdote, and I hope you forgive me. One tiny anecdote is that old habits die hard. I can't forget it. But I am trying. Gosh, I am trying. I'll wrap it up. One person that he had a connection with in the Hasidic community, who he made sure, literally swore that he would maintain secrecy, wasn't going to let people know of his identity, one time convinced him to join a Shalashudas. There was a big Rebbe coming from somewhere, and they were doing a Shalashudas with the Hasidim, and he told him, he schlepped him, kicking and screaming. He had him come. And he sat there around the table looking completely out of place. And he was sitting next to his friend, and across the table was sitting one of the Hasidim from the place. Listen to this. So this is all recorded. You can look it up. In the middle of the Shalosh Shudas, his friend is telling over this story. He hears the Chassid sitting across from the Yablana Rebbe, George Nagel, telling his friend, "This is called the Shalosh Shudas." He says, "I remember back in Europe when I sat by the Yablana Rebbe. That was a Shalosh Shudas. That was it." Can you imagine? And across from him on the table is sitting the Yablana Rebbe. Pile Plais. He actually started to make the news because at the age of 78, he decided when his shipping, whatever company fell apart, he decided to go to school. And he graduated from college, and he made national headlines as one of the oldest graduates of that particular college. And this was George Nagel. At the very end of his life, someone contacted him and told him, "Listen, take a trip to Eretz Yisrael. Come back to your place. The people are completely oblivious as to who you are, what's happened to you." It was back in the days, there was nothing. He just disappeared. Mamish disappeared. Somehow they convinced him to come for a trip. And he came. He came and he visited. And along this visit, I'm just going to read you a couple of lines here, because it's also shaykh to Pesach Sheni, and it's also shaykh to Rebbe Shimon, and it's also shaykh to never giving up, and it's also shaykh to Yidden will make it to the end, and it's also shaykh to believing in ourselves, and not giving up. The day arrived, and George landed at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. A car was waiting to pick him up for the 1.5 ride to Kfar Hasidim. The car drove through the entrance of the village and stopped at the nondescript house in Rehov HaMiyastim, where George's niece Arella lived with her husband Mordechai. He hadn't seen her for 40 years. Arella ran over to George and hugged him. "Welcome home, Uncle," she bubbled. "We have a surprise for you." A surprise? He wasn't sure if he liked the idea of a surprise. He was he was a broken person. He was just a broken person. Imagine how he felt in the inner recesses of his heart about what he had done and the guilt that he felt. He was a broken person. He wasn't one for surprises. "Yes," she replied, "but we need to drive up the road to the social hall. There are a few people who are waiting to meet you." They arrived at the hall, which was packed with hundreds of people who had gathered to meet the man who had put Kfar Hasidim literally on the map. Old and young, religious and secular, everyone connected to the village was there. A seat at the front was left empty for George, and as a hush descended, he slowly made his way toward his seat and sat down under the large welcome sign that adorned the front wall. Surreal, right? Totally surreal. An elderly man stood up and turned toward George. "Rebbe, do you remember me?" he asked. George looked at him, trying to figure out who he was. "I'm not sure," he said. "Are you Chaimke? Chaimke Geldfarb?" Chaimke smiled. "Yes, Rebbe, it's me." His voice was hoarse with emotion. "On behalf of all the residents of our kfar, I want to welcome you back home. You were probably nervous to come here." Listen to this. Deep, deep this. "You probably think we are angry with you. You probably think that because you brought us here from Poland, away from our homes, away from our families to build your dream, not ours, and then it all went wrong, so you think we are angry that it all went wrong. But Rebbe, if that's what you think, you're mistaken. Because Rebbe, you saved our lives. If it were not for you, we would have all been killed by the Nazis." "Look over there," Chaimke pointed toward a group of people in the middle of the hall. "That's my son and his wife and children. And next to him, my 2 daughters with their husbands and children. My parents, my uncles, my aunts, my brothers, my sisters, and their children, all murdered by the Nazis. But we came with you, Rebbe. We built this place. We founded this village. We survived. And you were the one who saved our lives. And for that, we thank you. Thank you for our lives and for the lives of our children and our grandchildren. We can never thank you enough." Chaimke sat down and an old woman rose to speak. "Rebbe, do you remember me?" George looked carefully at her. "Shendel, is that you?" "Shendel, yes, but now they call me Shoshana." Shendel had a lump in her throat as she spoke, and she struggled to get the words out. "Rebbe, where have you been for so many years? We missed you. We needed you. Without you, we would all be dead. We would not have our beautiful lives and our beautiful Israel. Why did you leave? Everything turned out okay in the end. Look at us. Look at how lucky we are. We escaped from the murderers. We built our own homes in God's promised land. You said we could do it, and we did it." Shendel began weeping. Tears flowed down her cheeks as her daughter next to her put an arm around her shoulder. "Rebbe, come home," Shendel sobbed. "You've been gone for far too long. It's time for you to come home." There was dead silence beside Shendel's muffled sobs. George looked around the hall. Everyone was looking at him. He looked down at his hands and then at the floor. Slowly, he got to his feet. "This will end. My friends, my dear, dear friends," he began. "I am so moved by this warm welcome. I don't have very much to say. I have missed this place and all of you so much for all these years. I never understood how much this place meant to me and how much I meant to you until now. I never thought about what you just said. I never thought about the fact that I saved your lives, only about all the lives that were lost. I never thought about what I gave you, only about what I took away from you. But now it's all become clear." He paused for a few seconds. You could have heard a pin drop. Then George whispered slowly, deliberately, "It's time. I'm ready. I'm coming home. I'm ready. I'm coming home." And he sat down. There was a moment of silence, and suddenly the hall erupted in applause. Everyone rose to their feet and applauded. It went on as George made his way through the hall and shook everyone's hand, smiling broadly. The Yablana Reba had returned to Kfar Hasidim, and now he was going to move back. He wrapped up his affairs in LA. He grew his pace and his beard, and he became the Rebbe again. This is him at the end of his life with the beard. And they accepted him fully. He ran Tishin, Shalashidis, like nothing happened. The story is about subjective perspective, how we see ourselves. How many people give up because they're focusing on nekudas that they feel, this is who I am, this is what I've done, and so, finished. And the Rebbe says, okay, but do you know how many lives you also saved? Do you know how much is gained through the process? Do you know how much your efforts are bearing the torch of generations of Babbas and Zaydas who cried and sacrificed for you as you are? Which is already a bonus, which is already supernatural, which is already Rebbe Shimon's light of Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker. So the Rebbe says there are people that have given up. There's no hope for them. And this is a reference to Rebbe Shimon. The tzaddik needs to have the power to awaken them. Never, ever, ever to give up. No matter what you've done and no matter what you're experiencing. Ein shem yish ba'ilam klal, laharis lehem, to show to them, laha'ir be'em, Reb Shimon's light, ki adayin Hashem imam, ve'etzlam, ve'karav lehem, va'afilu b'soicha aretz mamish. Hashem is close to you, near you, next to you, even when you're buried 6 feet under. HaKadosh Baruch Hu kiviyachol tzarech haisanu, Hashem, so to speak, needs us as kol echad ve'echad meitanu, va'aleinu hu aymer, and about each and every one of us he said, Ahavti eschem, Amar Hashem. This is Lag BaOmer, Chevra. You come to Lag BaOmer, it's a day where the pneumius of Torah is shining, the pneumius of nature is shining, but most importantly, and this is why you see that everyone comes to Miron, what is it that calls them? I don't know, but whatever it is that's calling them is not calling their appearance, it's not calling their communal affiliation, it's not calling what shul they happen to daven in or how they happen to spend their time or where in Europe their family is from. It's not calling the fact that they're either Sephardi or Ashkenazi. It's not calling the fact that they either wear a velvet yarmulke or a kippah surga. It's calling them. It's calling the libi that abides beyond the facade of Ani Yishena. That's Lag BaOmer. That's Lag BaOmer. And so I bless us to be able to, and we are, to connect to the aura of Reb Shimon, to be Reb Shimon people. To literally develop eyes that just, it doesn't see anything chitzayni. It's lo yala ala das, it's lo ba b'cheshbon. That's not what we're in this for. It's the small-minded externalities of what it means to be an Orthodox Jew in 20, no. Netzach Yisrael, we're connected to Torah's emes. It's beyond all of this. Never, ever, ever to become confused as to who we are and how close or how far from Hashem we may feel. Libi should be zeicha to connect to this on Lag BaOmer. Should be zeicha to all the hashpais of Lag BaOmer. It's a big day. And Pesach Sheni tonight, tomorrow, we should try to eat some matzah. And to remember that it's never too late for a Pesach Sheni, like the Heilige Yablana Reba, which, by the way, I didn't have a picture of it, but if you go to the place where he's buried in Kfar Chabad and you look at the gravestone, which I saw a picture of, I was never there, you would think that it's mamish a gravestone of an Admar. There's no mention. Mamish, the whole thing, Admar, this and that, all the titles, Echet Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Bracha, and the whole thing, because B'Makom Shebali Tshuva Imdim, Tzadikim Gemurim Ein Michalim Lamed. But what's so beautiful about it is because he didn't leave because he didn't believe. He didn't leave. He left because his feeling of shame and guilt was so overwhelming that he couldn't permit himself. He thought that he no longer deserved it. And he discovered that There's no such thing. L'chaim, l'chaim. Ashreinu. L'chaim. Thank you very, very much. It popped into my head to say the story. I'm happy I did, even though it ended up being an hour anyway. L'chaim.